Yes ranks alongside King Crimson, Genesis, and Pink Floyd as among the most famous, influential, and innovative prog rock bands of all time. Yes's reputation as one of the principal originators of prog rock is largely founded on 6 classic albums released in the early 70s. They are the Yes album, Fragile, Close to the Edge, the live Yes songs, Tales from Topographic Oceans, and Relayer. These groundbreaking albums were followed by a set of albums that contained more accessible music, including several hit singles which brought Yes to a much wider audience. These included Going for the One, Drama, and most of all, 90125. The main hit singles during this period were Wondrous Stories, and Owner of a Lonely Heart. The latter was a #1 in the US in 1983. The above-mentioned 9 albums account for a large amount of the 30 million sales worldwide that Yes has amassed over the decades. In total, an amazing 23 studio albums, 18 live albums, and 41 singles have been released under the Yes banner. The classic lineup of Yes that created most of the above-mentioned early 70s albums consisted of singer John Anderson, guitarist Steve Howe, keyboardist Rick Wakeman, and bassist Chris Squire, with either Bill Bruford or Alan White on drums. However, a total of 20 musicians have been official Yes band members over the years. Amongst them are well-known names like Trevor Horn, Eddie Jobson, Trevor Rabin, Jeff Downes, Patrick Moraz, and many more. Yes is not only known for endless personnel changes, but also for band members working together in a whole swathe of offshoots. The 2 main ones were Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe, and Anderson, Rabin, Wakeman. Other associated acts include Asia, UK, GTR, Cinema, XYZ, Conspiracy, Anderson Wakeman, and more. In part because of personnel complications, it took until 2017 for Yes to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, when 2 camps of musicians just about tolerated each other on stage. As one band member commented, "It's no secret that Yes is political as hell. It's always been that way. It seems to be one of the things that drives the engine. It should be a reality TV show." Part of the reality TV show was that for a while 2 incarnations of Yes existed simultaneously after the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. There was a Yes with guitarist Steve Howe, drummer Alan White, keyboardist Jeff Downes, vocalist John Davison, and bassist Billy Sherwood. And a band that called itself Yes featuring John Anderson, Trevor Rabin, and Rick Wakeman, augmented by 3 live musicians. The history of Yes is complicated. To make the subject manageable in a 1-hour video, we will focus mainly on the 9 above-mentioned essential Yes albums, and try to get to the bottom of why the band's music is so great and why it had such a far-reaching influence. To go all the way to the beginning, John Anderson was born in northwest England in 1944. He began his singing career in 1964 in a band called The Warriors.
The first band I was with was called The Warriors. We used to copy the Beatles. I used to go on stage thinking, I'm Paul McCartney, I'm going to sing I'm Down. And I used to scream it out. And then I used to enjoy just the idea of the girls and the travelling and everything like. There was a bit of an escapism.
After the band split at the end of 1967, he moved to London. Anderson had 2 songs released on Parlophone Records under the pseudonym Hans Christian. They were not successful. Anderson also briefly joined a band called The Gun, but ended up working at a bar in Soho. The owner of the bar, Jack Barry, introduced Anderson to Chris Squire, bassist in the psychedelic rock group Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. Born in London in 1948, Squire sang in a choir as a boy. and started playing bass as a teenager. In 1965, when he was 17, he acquired the instrument he would become famous for, a Rickenbacker 4001 electric bass. Squire had played in the Souths and the Sin, which also featured guitarist Peter Banks. Historical accounts of those early days vary, and in 1967 Squire either formed or joined Mabel Greer's toy shop, and Banks also soon became a member. Anderson and Squire immediately hit it off when introduced to each other by Barry, and the singer ended up joining Mabel Greer's toy shop as well. The band played in local clubs and universities, and by the summer of 1968, drummer Bill Bruford and keyboardist Tony Kaye were also playing in the band. The quintet rehearsed for a month in a cafe called the Lucky Horseshoe in central London. The realization quickly dawned that they had an unusual chemistry as musicians, and a decision was taken to call the band Yes. Their first gig under the new name took place in August 1968 at a youth camp in East Mersey, Essex. A month later, they had found a manager, Roy Flynn, who invested a lot of his personal money in the band. Flynn managed to secure an audition with Ahmet Ertegun, founder of Atlantic Records, and in March of 1969, Yes signed with the label, which already had Led Zeppelin under contract. Recordings for Yes's debut album began on April 16, 1969, and took place at Advision and Trident, with Paul Klain producing, Gerald Shevin and John Anthony engineering. Anthony would later become known for his work with Van de Graaff Generator and Genesis. The recordings were fraught with technical difficulties and personal friction. Shevin apparently disliked rock music, and Clay only had experience working on film soundtracks. But somehow an album was recorded. It contained 8 tracks, including 2 covers, I See You by the Byrds and Every Little Thing by the Beatles, and 2 tracks that dated from Mabel Greer's toy shop era. The band's self-titled debut album was released on October 1969. Despite the inauspicious recording process and the band still trying to forge a musical identity, the music on the album was surprisingly strong and well produced. A high level of musicianship is evident throughout, and although the jazz, folk, psychedelic, pop and Beatle influences are still very obvious and not yet well integrated, there are standout tracks in the opener, Beyond and Before. Reaching out beyond and before. And I See You. I see you. And in the dynamic arrangement of Every Little Thing. Yes, I know I'm a lucky guy. Yes toured relentlessly after the release of their debut album, but were already back in Advision 2 months later in December of 1969. This time they were joined by Tony Colton, a friend of Anderson and the singer in the band Head, Hands and Feet, who had agreed to produce. Eddie Offord was the engineer and recorded the band to 8-track. Offord would go on to forge a long-term relationship with Yes, producing and engineering many of their key albums. John Anderson was writing most of the band's material at this point, and his love of science fiction and mysticism began to shine through in his lyrics, while his love of classical music informed many of the musical ideas he put forward. He said, "I had speakers at the bottom of my bed, blasting out classical music all the time. I was interested in opening up the sound of the band, developing a string sound. We decided to use real classical musicians, which was kind of an adventure, really." Tony Cox was commissioned to write a number of orchestral arrangements, which were recorded by students from the Royal College of Music, directed by Cox. However, Banks disagreed with both the use of orchestral arrangements and the involvement of Colton as producer, which led to tension in the band. The album recordings lasted until February of 1970 and were followed by 2 concerts at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London in March, with a 20-piece orchestra during which most of the material for the new album was played. The concerts were marred by all manner of technical problems, as well as more friction with Banks, and he was fired in April. It was the first example of a constant coming and going of band members, which became known as the revolving door policy. The 4 remaining members apparently already had another guitarist in mind. They had seen Steve Howe playing around clubs in London and, impressed, invited him for an audition. Howe joined Yes in June of 1970. Born in 1947 in North London, Howe had started to play guitar at the age of 12 and absorbed a wide variety of influences, including jazz guitarists like Wes Montgomery and Barney Kessel, finger-picking pioneer Chet Atkins, as well as folk and classical guitar. Like everyone in the late 60s, he eventually became transfixed by rock and roll. By the time Howe joined Yes, he was 23, and he had already built a substantial professional track record, having been a member of the bands The Syndicates, Tomorrow and Bodust, and played as a session musician, and even having had some solo singles released. Howe's unique approach to the guitar, using both acoustic and electric guitars, and most famously the hollow-bodied ES-175D, fitted perfectly with the musical direction the other four members of Yes wanted to pursue. However, before their collaboration could bear fruit, the band had to overcome a number of problems. If Howe had been aware of the dire straits the band was in at the time, he might have chosen not to join. At this point, the band was running out of money, as was manager Roy Flynn, who told them he could bankroll them no further, and he would later in the year quit as their manager. Bill Bruford recalled, "I remember we were down to £50. How the band survived till the next day, I don't know. It was all but over. We were signed at the same time as Led Zeppelin, and they were doing pretty well. And King Crimson had this astonishing first album. We were just knocked backwards by that and jealous as heck." All hopes were set on the new album, Time and a Word, which was released in July of 1970, with a picture of a naked woman on the cover. Atlantic Records in America deemed it too risque, so the new cover photo was taken with Howe in it, even though he had not played on the album. The album yielded a number of tracks that would become Yes classics, including the title song, Sweet Dreams,
Sweet dreams console the future. Sweet
and Astral Traveller. But the band itself had mixed feelings. Some felt the new album was a big step upwards from their debut, but Chris Squire remarked, "I'd imagine it sounding much grander somehow, but we didn't quite get there." Critical reaction was also muted, and it only reached number 45 in the UK charts. Because of the poor sales, the big shots at Atlantic Records planned to drop the band. The label was talked out of this, but at various points in 1970, Yes found themselves without a guitarist, a manager, money, and a record company that believed in them. It led to persistent talk of throwing in the towel altogether. Bill Bruford later remarked it was a very bleak period after that second album when nothing really happened at all. We were still stunningly unfamous. However, Steve Howe came not only with impressive guitar talents, but also top-class writing talent and tons of creative energy. Several weeks of songwriting and rehearsing at a farmhouse in Devon yielded almost magical results. There also apparently was a ghost in the house who, Anderson said, liked what we were doing. We thought that was a good sign. During the rehearsals in Devon, Flynn broke the news that he was leaving, and Tony Kaye broke his foot in a car accident. It all added to the sense of pressure, but the general feeling that the new material they were writing and rehearsing was exceptional kept the band going. In autumn of 1970, they once again convened at Advision for recording sessions, with Eddie Offord engineering and co-producing with the band. Offord later recalled that he was by now recording the band to 16-track and using a very outdated, very old, antiquated console. Some of the faders weren't even faders. They were these big rotary pots. There was absolutely nothing in the way of effects. The only thing we had was an EMT echo plate, but nothing else. Everything else you had to do yourself. The basic tracks were pretty much just drums and bass, maybe with a guide guitar track and probably no keyboards. Chris was extremely precise and would want every kick, drum and bass note to be locked in time-wise. I think eventually that drove Bill crazy. He wanted a little more freedom. Getting a minute of music might take several hours of experimentation. So the basic tracks were long sessions. They might start at 2 in the afternoon and go till 2 or 3 in the morning. In interviews, the band sang the praises of Offord, who appeared on his way to become to the band what George Martin was to the Beatles. He was like another member of the band, said Anderson, while Howe added, Eddie found a way of allowing us to play intricate parts, and when you play the thing back, you could hear them all. Eddie contoured the sounds in such a luxurious way that he allowed everyone to be heard equally. Yes's third album was released in February of 1971 under the title The Yes Album, because, in the words of Anderson, we felt it was the first real Yes album. Critical reactions were far more positive than the previous one, in recognition of the fact that Yes had finally found its own unique prog rock style. All songs were written by the band members, and 3 tracks in particular, Yours Is No Disgrace,
Yours is no disgrace.
Starship Trooper, and I've Seen All Good People became classics.
I've seen all good people turn their heads each day so sad.
However, it still needed a sleight of hand from their new manager, Brian Lane, and an amazing stroke of good fortune for the album to be commercially successful. There was a postal strike in the UK in the beginning of 1971, which meant that the record shops were unable to send their sales figures to Melody Maker, and the magazine was unable to compile the nationwide charts. Richard Branson, never shy to jump on an opportunity, created charts in his Virgin record store, which the BBC and national newspapers began to use as a temporary substitute for the real thing. Lane also recognised a business opportunity when he saw one, and in an echo of Brian Epstein in 1962 buying copies of the Beatles' Love Me Do to push the single up the charts, Lane bought enough copies of the Yes album at Branson's record store for it to go to number 1 on the Virgin Store's album charts. It raised the profile of the album considerably, and it later reached to number 4 in the nationwide album chart when it was up and running again. Bill Bruford commented the band's morale had been going down, but was saved just in the nick of time. The Yes album was both a last chance and a new start for the band.
And I think you did in fact record Yours Is No Disgrace, some of it. Well, that's nice because that for us is a group number that is associated very much with the group, and we feel very at home playing it. It's easy for us to play. And I think if you've got that one, that most probably would be the most representative thing.
On a sailing ship to nowhere, leaving any...
With the band finally enjoying commercial momentum, they were keen to also continue their upwards creative momentum. And once again, a band member was fired who was judged to stand in the way. While Tony Kaye was undoubtedly a master of the Hammond organ, he was reluctant to expand to playing synthesizers as well. Keith Emerson's modular Moog system had been stationed in Advision following some Emerson, Lake and Palmer recordings, and Yes had managed to add a few sounds from it to the Yes album. For the band, this was the sound of the future, and having spotted a suitable replacement in Rick Wakeman, the revolving door was set in motion and Kaye was out and Wakeman was in. Born just outside London in 1949, Wakeman was an award-winning, classically trained keyboard player who had performed in a number of local bands before becoming an in-demand session player in 1969. Among his notable session achievements were playing Mellotron on Space Oddity by David Bowie, and piano on Morning Has Broken by Cat Stevens. In 1970, Wakeman joined the Strawbs. He performed on more songs by David Bowie and has quoted the artist as one of his biggest influences. In July of 1971, Bowie invited Wakeman to join the Spiders from Mars, and on the same day he was asked by Chris Squire to join Yes. When Wakeman sat in with the band for a rehearsal, there was an explosion of creative energy. The foundations for the two most famous tracks on the band's next album, Roundabout and Heart of Sunrise, came into being that day, and so Wakeman decided to turn down David Bowie. Recordings for the new album again took place at Advision from August 11th to September 5th, 1971, once more with Offord as co-producer and engineer. For reasons that pretty much all participants remember differently, each of the band members recorded a short solo track for the album, with Steve Howe's solo acoustic guitar piece, Mood for a Day, and Squire's The Fish, the most substantial. While the 5 individual tracks varied greatly in quality, the 4 group tracks have become Yes classics and gone down in history as foundational to the prog rock genre. Roundabout, a composition by Anderson and Howe, is the most famous. The acoustic guitar intro has become iconic, and the same has happened with Chris Squire's bass part, which drives most of the song. Howe explained in 2014, John and I were in a hotel room up in Scotland when we started writing that song. We seemed to find a lot of time to do that in the 70s. We had a private plane. We got to places. People sat by the pool. And John and I were there in the hotel room going, well, what have you got that's a bit like this? We used to quiz one another like that. This was the era of cassettes, and I've still got all of them. With Roundabout, we had all these bits of music, tentative moments. I was big on intros back then, and the classical guitar intro I came up with for Roundabout was really one of the most signature things. And I believe I thought of the backward piano also in the intro, but I won't lay 100% claim to that in case I'm wrong. But basically the song just kept developing. John and I presented as much as we had to the band, and the band had a fair amount of input. What Yes were brilliant at, even before I joined, was arranging skills. The other 3 group tracks are South Side of the Sky, Long Distance Runaround, and Heart of the Sunrise.
Lost in their eyes as you hurry by.
The ingredients of the classic Yes sound are in place on the group tracks, combining Anderson's high, ethereal vocals, Howe's multifaceted guitar parts, often played on a Gibson ES5 Switchmaster, Wakeman's classically inspired keyboards, Guire's distinct melodic approach to playing bass, and Bruford's jazz-influenced drumming, keeping the band together as it navigates its way through complex, extended pieces of music, often with unusual and repeatedly changing time signatures. Yes's 4th studio album was released on November the 12th, 1971, only 9 months after its predecessor. It was the first with a cover by Roger Dean. The artist would go on to design many covers of albums by Yes, and of several of the associated acts. He was also responsible for Virgin Records' first logo. Fragile was immediately recognised by critics as a breakthrough, and its stellar reputation continues to this day. It made it to number 7 on the UK charts and number 4 on the Billboard charts, and has gone 2 times platinum in the US. Roundabout was a major and very unlikely hit in the US, and Long Distance Runaround became a staple of AOR radio. In 2015, Fragile made it to number 10 of Rolling Stone's list of greatest prog rock albums of all time. In an unusual move, Yes went on to tour Fragile with engineer-producer Eddie Offord, who remembered, they said, "Look, we need you to come out on tour with us to help us recreate this thing live." At that time, there were no samplers or anything, so I had all these kinds of church organs and vocal cues spliced onto a Revox tape machine. At different parts of the songs, I'd hit the play button and cue in some of the parts that they couldn't quite manage to do live. By June of 1972, Yes had written enough material for a new album, and again went to Advision to record it, with Offord as their main collaborator. On a high from touring together, Offord had a stage constructed in the studio for the band to play on, to try and recreate the feeling and sound of a live performance. Despite, or perhaps because of, the critical and commercial success the band was enjoying, the session for their 5th album, Close to the Edge, was fraught with conflict. Yes members were very passionate and vocal about what they wanted and did not shy away from creative conflicts. This was particularly the case with the Close to the Edge sessions. Offord recalled, as the band became more successful, the hours spent in the studio would be even longer and longer. There'd be a session starting at 2 and Chris wouldn't show up until 4 or 5. People would get frustrated, but it was big money now, big success. I still really love that album. The problems you came up with, you just dealt with. When journalist Chris Welch visited the studio, he reported intense conflict between band members and late-night sessions that led, in one case, to Offord falling asleep at the mixing desk. There particularly was a lot of friction between Bruford and Squire, with the bassist wanting the drummer to adapt his drum parts to his bass parts. Despite perhaps because of the friction, Close to the Edge turned out to be a masterpiece that continues to be regarded as the pinnacle of progressive rock, making it to number 1 of almost every list of best prog albums of all time. The album's reputation is largely based on its almost 19 minutes long title song, which is a tour de force of musical inventiveness. The track was written by Anderson and Howe, with significant contribution by the others. Anderson had been influenced by Jean Sibelius' 7th Symphony with regards to the structure. Close to the Edge begins with a tape loop of natural sounds, including bird sounds and a river, which leads to a section with a partly improvised and rather abstract guitar solo. The semi-improvised intro was in part inspired by the Mahavishnu Orchestra, who Yes had toured with. Howe's main guitar on Close to the Edge was a Gibson ES345, and he also played pedal steel for the first time, an instrument that would become increasingly important to him. Wakeman played the mellotron and mini-moog and the pipe organ at the St Giles Without Cripplegate Church in central London. Offered, it gets a little hazy for me because I did a lot of work with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I remember recording in churches, but I can't remember which band was where. I think I just recorded them right onto a Revox and then laid them into the tracks. I just used a couple of mics to record. In that situation, more isn't necessarily better. There also would have been 6 or 7 tracks of Rick's Moog. There was no polyphonic synthesizer, so anything like a string section or brass section or whatever was done note by note. It meant recording lots of tracks and bouncing down, doing lots of backing vocals and bouncing them. Vocals were recorded with a Neumann U64 and guitars with an old AKG C28. Close to the Edge was recorded in short sections of a few bars each, with endless overdubs, leaving Offered with the task of fitting all of the pieces together on one 24-track tape recorder. The 24-track and the 2-track mastering deck were both Scully's, and the console in the studio was custom-made by Advision. Speakers were custom-made as well from JBL components. They actually weren't that good in reproducing the low end, and so that had to be taken into account as we mixed. Side 2 of the album contains 2 long pieces, the folk-inspired And You and I listen hard but could not see, and the more rocky Siberian Katru, which features Wakeman on harpsichord. Howe's guitar solo was recorded by an assistant swinging a microphone around to obtain a Leslie-like effect. Offered explains, nowadays you could probably get the same effect with a harmonizer or something, but it started with us thinking about trying to get a Leslie sound, and then I thought, well, instead of having the speakers revolving, why not have the microphone revolving? So we tried it on a short piece of wire, and we eventually had it long and swinging around the studio. It had that backwards sound. It was kind of cool. Close to the Edge was released on September the 13th, 1972, and was immediately recognised as, one critic called it, a flawless masterpiece. It also did well commercially, reaching number 4 in the UK, number 3 in the US, and number 1 in the Netherlands. The entire album became part of the band's live set, and was included on Yes's first live album, the triple album Yes Songs, released in May of 1973. It had been recorded in 1972 in the US and the UK. Because Offered travelled with the band to be able to play back certain parts with the Revox tape recorder, he was also ideally placed to supervise the live recordings. The album was mixed at Advision and again was a critical and commercial success. It galvanised Yes's reputation as one of the world's most exciting live bands. Close to the edge, down by a river. Bruford features on only 3 songs, with Alan White on the remainder. Bruford had left Yes in July of 1972. Fed up with all the internal strife, he did not hesitate to make his move from when he was invited to join King Crimson. White was already familiar with the band as he shared a flat with Offered and had sat in with the band for the recording session for Close to the Edge. White already had a stellar reputation as a session drummer, having worked with John Lennon, George Harrison and Steve Winwood. With their concert 1 week away, Yes was desperate for a new drummer and invited White on the tour. He had only days to learn the material, and it took him a while to come to grips with it. Yes continued to tour the world, with Anderson and Squire in increasingly heated arguments that nearly split the band. However, touring gave Anderson and Howe ample time to, as the latter put it, fool around in hotel rooms using a cassette recorder. Anderson had become increasingly inspired by spiritual themes and decided to use 2 books, The Finding of the Third Eye and The Autobiography of a Yogi, as the foundation for the lyrics of the next album. In line with the way each previous album had been built and expanded on the album before, Anderson and Howe looked to expand on Close to the Edge. Their lyrical and musical concepts became even more ambitious and led them to mastermind a double album with just 4 long tracks. We were really up for the big challenging things. Let's do an album with 4 Close to the Edges, said Howe. Anderson, the band wanted to make a big statement worldwide. I wanted to create music that had length and breadth and adventure and that would carry the audience through this experience. Also incorporating contributions from the other 3 band members during the 5 months of its making, the end result was a concept double album called Tales from Topographic Oceans, consisting of 4 tracks, each filling one side of a vinyl disc. However, Tales from Topographic Oceans was the first US album that would lead to strong disagreements among fans and critics, and the album has become synonymous with prog rock excess. Tales from Topographic Oceans also caused major disagreements amongst the team itself, with Wakeman and Offord afterwards publicly disparaging the album. The tales of the band recreating a farm inside the recording studio, including straw bales, a white fence, farming equipment, and full-size wooden cows, are the epitome of Spinal Tap folly. The band started work on the album by rehearsing and expanding on material supplied by Anderson and Howe at Manticore Studios in South London, which was located in a former cinema and owned by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Wakeman and Offord were already uneasy with the project, and divisions deepened by a rift about where to actually do the recordings. Anderson, Wakeman and Offord were keen on a complete change of scenery and lobbied for a studio in the countryside, while Squire and Howe wanted to stay in London. A compromise was reached to record at Morgan Studios in North London, not least because it had a 3M M79 24-track tape machine, and then to make the studio feel and look like a farm. Offord explained, "I was pushing manager Brian Lane to record an album in a country setting because I thought some flowers and trees would help people chill out a little bit. Maybe it won't be quite so confined as when you're in a town studio. I thought it might give some kind of rebirth." The compromise we finally arrived on occurred when we walked into Morgan Studios, and there already were these large wooden cows and our whole place was filled with trees and plants. Morgan was the way to try to get a fresh start. But about halfway through the album, the cows were covered with graffiti and all the plants had died. That just about sums up that whole album. I was never surprised by the things Yes came up with, but just a regular Yes album took forever to record, and now we were doing one twice as long. It was awful. The Tales album broke my spirit, because I knew then that it was the beginning of the end. It being a double album with the fighting getting worse, it was already really tedious in the studio. There were other Spinal Tap moments, for example, John Anderson asking an assistant engineer to recreate the acoustics of his bathroom by covering a studio space with exactly the same bathroom tiles as he had at home. When Anderson was singing, the tiles started to fall off. As before, the music was recorded minute by minute, with countless overdubs, and often given the task of piecing everything together. The same painstaking process was also applied to the mix, as Anderson recalled. It was crazy, but we would mix in sections, 2 minute, 1 minute, 4 minutes, and so on. Then we'd have the 1/4-inch tapes hanging from the wall, and Eddie would then stick it together with sellotape. And that was how we made albums in those days. There was no automation or click tracks. Offord remembers, "Those mixes were not easy, but at least I rarely had any of the band put their hands on the faders. I would mix it in the same way I recorded it, in sections. I would get a part right and then move on without automation. It would have been impossible to do it any other way." Things got so tedious and tiring that Offord, after working through the night with Anderson present to complete the final mixes, walked out of the studio at 9 a.m. with the mixtapes. When Offord could not find his keys, he put the tapes on the roof of his car. Naturally, when Anderson and Offord drove off, they forgot about the tapes still on the roof. They made a quick U-turn when they realised and found the tapes in the middle of the road. There was a big, red double-decker bus coming towards us, says Anderson, and I ran out and stopped the bus. That was our wild experience of making this album. We nearly had it crunched under a double-decker bus. Atlantic had invested £90,000 in the album in recording costs alone, the equivalent of $900,000 in today's money. It's probably focused the record company's mind when presented with an album that was made up of 4 long tracks, or movements as the band called them. Atlantic had no other choice but to put all of its weight behind promoting the album, which was graced with a sublime cover by Roger Dean. It was voted best album cover of all time by readers of Rolling Stone earlier this century. Tales of Topographic Oceans was released in the UK in December of 1973, after a promotional campaign of nearly 2 months that included radio broadcasts of the entire album, and probably did more to confuse and prejudice people than warm them to it. Perhaps surprisingly, the album was a commercial success. It was the first ever album certified gold by the British phonographic industry, purely based on pre-orders, and it became the band's first UK number 1. It also went to number 6 in the US. However, reviews were mixed, And as mentioned earlier, many regarded the album as a gigantic misstep. The moment when prog rock finally went from close to the edge to over the edge. Comments from the band members haven't helped, with Wakeman, who was perhaps distracted by also being busy writing music for the Journey to the Centre of the Earth, expressing the opinion, Yes was heading towards avant-garde jazz rock, and I had nothing to offer there. Tales from Topographic Oceans is like a woman's padded bra. The cover looks good, the outside looks good, and it's got all the right ingredients. But when you peel off the padding, there's not a lot there. I think it's a dreadfully padded album. There are some nice parts, but it's like wading through a cesspool to get to a water lily. Despite all this, time has been surprisingly kind on the album, and it has in recent decades been reappraised as arguably Yes's greatest moment. It certainly is one of Yes's most challenging. As one critic put it, Tales from Topographic Oceans is the black hole of Yes experiences. The band dissipating, expanding, exploding, and imploding all at once. Stephen Wilson, who remixed 5 of Yes's classic albums, including Tales of Topographic Oceans in 2016, has commented, "One of the things I miss in modern rock music is the will to reach for the stars and risk falling flat on your face. Conventional wisdom might be that with this album, Yes roundly achieved the latter, but I'm happy to see a growing number of those like me that appreciate its beauty and ambition. I think given time, it reveals itself as perhaps their greatest musical statement of all." Yes toured Tales of Topographic Oceans at length, but had to face the reality that playing all 4 sides in their entirety was a bridge too far for most of their audiences, and opted to play just 2 sides per concert. Wakeman remained unhappy with the music and left the band at the end of the album tour on the 18th of May 1974, which happened to be his birthday. The fact that Journey to the Centre of the Earth was about to go number 1 in the UK charts must also have focused his mind on something other than Yes. Soon after the tour, the remaining 4 band members started writing and rehearsing new material for what would become their Relayer album at Farmyard Studios just outside London. When they felt they had made some headway, they started looking around for a new keyboard player. Vangelis was one of the candidates who was considered. But the next swing of the revolving door ended in August when Swiss keyboardist Patrick Moraz joined the band. He had written film scores and been a member of the prog rock band Refugee. The new 5-piece proceeded with recording sessions in the garage of Chris Squire's house in Surrey, which he had converted into a recording studio. Eddie Offord was once again present as an engineer and co-producer, and brought in a 24-track recorder and a mixing desk from his own mobile rig. Offord explained, "Chris's studio was half built, so I just put my equipment in. It was a 30-channel board, which fit into 3 different flight cases. There was a 24-track MCI, which I had cut into 3 pieces so it would fit into flight cases. I also remember John bringing in all kinds of weird percussion things, metal sheets and so on for the track Gates of Delirium. It was basically all created with percussion." There's no record of Offord mentioning the names of the rest of his mobile gear, but according to the Relayer tour brochure, Offord's live setup at the time consisted of a IES 30-channel quadraphonic mixer with eventide phasers and digital delay, and an AKG echo unit, all custom built by IES, which stands for International Entertainment Services. The recording sessions were relatively short by Yes standards, despite the band reportedly recording the Gates of Delirium in 30-second to 1-minute sections, by some accounts without knowing how the song would end. Perhaps influenced by the mixed reactions to Tales from Topographic Oceans, Yes returned to the structure of their biggest critical success, Close to the Edge, with one long piece on one side, the Gates of Delirium, and 2 pieces on side 2, Sound Chaser and To Be Over. Relayer sounded markedly different from previous Yes albums. The arrival of Moraz meant that the strong classical elements that Wakeman brought to the band made way for funk and jazz rock influences. Mahavishnu Orchestra appeared an influence, and the intro to Sound Chaser could have come from a Weather Report or Return to Forever album. Chris Squire also regularly veers into jazz rock territory with his bass parts. However, Steve Howe is by far the most featured instrumentalist on the album, and most important change in the band's sound came from the fact that he switched from playing semi-acoustic guitars like the Gibson ES-175 to solid-body Fender Telecaster. He also played a lot of pedal steel. Relayer was released in the UK in November of 1974 and reached number 4 in the UK and number 5 in the US. Critical reaction was more positive than to Tales from Topographic Oceans. The tour for the album took in 88 dates and lasted until August 1975. The long-standing members of Yes must have felt that a cycle had come to an end because the decision was taken to put the band on hiatus to allow each member to record a solo album. And so John Anderson recorded Oleus of Sunhillow, Steve Howe Beginnings, Chris Squire Fish Out of Water, Patrick Moraz The Story of I, and Alan White Ramshackled. Perhaps the idea was also to see if they could emulate Rick Wakeman's enormous success as solo artists. But despite a 76-leg solo album tour, during which they played a combination of material from each of their solo albums and Yes material, their solo albums met with varied but limited success. After the solo albums tour ended in August of 1976, the band reconvened at Mountain Studios in Montreux, Switzerland. They had moved to the country for tax reasons. Moraz might have been forgiven for thinking that he'd be in for an easy time, given that he was working in home territory. But after a few weeks, a revolving door opened, and he was out, and Wakeman back in. Despite having enjoyed a number 2 hit in the UK with his third solo album, The Myths and Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Wakeman didn't hesitate when he was invited to return to the Yes fold. The intra-band politics for this latest personnel change are shrouded in mystery, but from a musical perspective, the band had decided to write shorter and more easily digestible songs, which was very much to Wakeman's liking. It seems likely the band's decision to change direction was also influenced by the punk movement that had exploded in 1976 and resulted in long hair, capes, and long pieces of music suddenly having become distinctly uncool. Anderson commented, "Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been experimenting a lot, and we're happy to have given that a chance. We've come back to a happier medium. If we wanted another Tales concept, we could have gone in that direction, but we needed to relax for a while, a little more laughing and jive." In another sign that the era had ended, Eddie Offord was not invited for the sessions. Instead, the band self-produced, and John Timperley, the resident engineer at Mountain Studios, was behind the controls. Recordings lasted until April 1977 and included another excursion to a church for Wakeman to record organ parts, this time to St. Martin's Church in Vevey just outside Montreux. Going for the One was released in July of 1977 and was a big commercial success, going to number 1 in the UK and number 8 in the US. Anderson called the album a kind of celebration, and Squire said the sound changed a bit for the album, and from what I remember, there were quite a few heated conversations over the amount of echo that was being used by certain people who loved echo, and it got a bit much at times. The lead single from the album, Wondrous Stories, also was a big hit in the UK. It was an odd choice for a single because the 2 most immediately arresting tracks on the album are Parallels and Going for the One. The latter was eventually also released as the second single and is graced by wonderful pedal steel playing by Howe, who said, "We really rocked out." After completing the 90-date Going for the One tour in December of 1977, Yes gathered again in London in February of 1978 to start rehearsing their next album, which was recorded at Advision and Rack Studios. The location was again a source of heated debate, as some band members wanted to record abroad. The conflicts only escalated from there. The band had asked Eddie Offord to come back in the fold, but the collaboration hit the rocks, and like with Going for the One, Yes ended up self-producing, this time with Jeff Young and Nigel Lubby engineering. This apparently led to a major issue with the sound, as Offord had recorded basic tracks using Dolby A noise reduction without marking it on the boxes, and so Young and Lubby must have played these back without Dolby A. The album, called Tormato, was released in September of 1978. While it has since gone platinum in the US, it is not highly regarded by most fans. critics and even band members. Squire called it a kind of hodgepodge of different songs, so it was hard to figure out what was good on it and what wasn't, and according to Howe it was overplayed and underproduced. Lots of notes. By contrast, the 101-date Tormato tour was a big success, and the band received a Golden Ticket Award for over $1 million in box office receipts. The tour ended in June of 1979. When the band tried to record its next album with producer Roy Thomas Baker, known for his work with Queen, the divisions in the band turned out to be unsurmountable. By March of 1980, both Anderson and Wakeman had left the band. It appeared that the classic Yes period had come to a rather inglorious end. However, there was to be a very unexpected next chapter in the band's history that delivered at least one more essential album, made with a very unlikely collaborator. This chapter in the history of Yes is one of the oddest ones, as there was widespread incredulity when news leaked out that Anderson and Howe had been replaced by pop duo The Buggles. The duo had enjoyed a major pop hit in 1979 with Video Killed the Radio Star. Prog rock fans had the Buggles down as the epitome of naff and lightweight, and the idea of them joining Yes fell under the category of cannot be serious. The connection between the Buggles and Yes was made because Brian Lane managed both acts. The Buggles consisted of singer Trevor Horn and keyboardist Jeff Downes, and to everyone's surprise, it turned out they were huge Yes fans. But small and with horn-rimmed glasses, Horn looked like a computer nerd and the antithesis of a major rock band's leading man. The new album the new five-piece worked on, Drama, was recorded in the late spring of 1980 at Townhouse and Psalm East, Roundhouse and Rack Studios in London, with Eddie Offord again engineering the backing tracks. Hugh Padgham, who would soon become famous for his work with Genesis and Peter Gabriel, was at the controls in the Townhouse. Drama was released in August of the year and surprised everyone by having a harder-hitting sound than previous Yes albums, with the 10-minute-long opener, Machine Messiah, quickly recognised as a classic Yes track. A song called Tempest Fugit also is a highlight. However, although the album went to number 2 in the UK, fans had great trouble accepting Horn as a legitimate replacement for Anderson, and this became a huge problem during live performances. The performances were good, but a large section of the band's fans simply did not accept Horn as a valid replacement for Anderson. For this reason, the band split immediately after the Drama tour ended in December of 1980, and all band members went off in different directions. Howe and Downes formed Asia, together with former King Crimson bassist and singer John Weston, and ELP drummer Carl Palmer. Squire and White tried to form a band with Jimmy Page called XYZ, X-Yes and X-Zeppelin, but this did not work out. Anderson went on to work with Vangelis. In 1982, Squire and White were introduced to South African guitarist Trevor Rabin, who had been a part of the band Rabbit and had moved to London and then the US to pursue a solo career. He had briefly been involved in the formation stages of Asia. Squire, White and Rabin started rehearsing several songs written by Rabin, which were shorter and more commercial than anything Yes had done. Because he enjoyed the simpler, more straightforward song format, former Yes keyboardist Tony Kaye agreed to join as well, and the quartet adopted the name Cinema. Trevor Horn initially considered becoming the vocalist, but then offered to produce the band's debut album. Recordings took place at Psalm and Air Studios in London, with Gary Langan and Julian Mendelssohn engineering and JJ Jexelik, the main programmer of the Fairlight CMI. It meant that a team was in place and music was being made that would lay the foundations for the sound of the 80s, and that helped Yes make the astonishing transformation from old fogey prog rockers stuck in the past to hit parade wonders and musical trendsetters. Just before working with Yes, Horn, Langan and Jexelik had played a central role in the making of The Lexicon of Love, the legendary debut album of ABC. At the beginning of 1983, the three were also at the heart of the legendary band The Art of Noise, and soon after they finished working with Yes, they worked on Relax, the music-changing song by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax. All these recordings feature the glossy, hard-hitting sample and drum machine-driven sound that Horn became famous for, and that would not only define the music of the 80s, but were in fact the first productions of the modern era that continues to this day. In working with Yes, this was most strongly exemplified on the song that became the album's opener and a worldwide hit, Owner of a Lonely Heart. It started life as a demo Rabin had recorded on a 4-track tape machine, and he had tried to find a place for it on several different environments, to no avail. Horn recognised its hit potential and suggested it to the band. The song went through various changes in terms of melodies and lyrics, but most importantly, it gave the band, Horn and his team, a chance to go for an ultra-modern sound and arrangement. One contentious aspect was the use of programmed drums, which White originally objected to, but he eventually relented. The song was recorded to a drum part programmed in an Akai MPC by White, Squire and Horn. Langen and Jesselik also sampled a drum part by White in The Fairlight. Hip-hop drummer Questlove of The Roots has said that the song contains the first example of sample used as a backbeat. Chris Squire played an Electra MPC Outlaw bass that had an inbuilt phaser and low octave. The song also contains a sample of a horn section of the song Call Is Back by Funk Incorporated. The sound effects are the most attention-grabbing aspect of the song and were completely new at the time, as Horn explains in this Sound on Sound video.
This was the stuff that really grabbed everybody's attention with these whiz bangs here. They were funny when you listen back to them. And it's quite a few. These were things, they were originally on the demo as mini moog fills, you know, beep, beep. But I thought it would be interesting to do them with weird sounds. And like, that's taken from a cassette. This one here is, that's made up of 6 tracks, that. Beep, diddly-lum. And let me just solo it up. I mean, nowadays everybody's used to this kind of thing, but back then, that's a synclavier and a Fairlight.
The synclavier was an early music workstation that could synthesize and sample sounds, and the Fairlight CMI has become renowned as the world's first commercially available sampler. By April of 1983, when the recordings for the album were almost complete, John Anderson joined the band, and writing recordings continued. With 4 former Yes members in the band, it was inevitable that the band would eventually call itself Yes, though not without another revolving door situation. Keyboardist Tony Kaye had left and was replaced by Eddie Jobson, who had played with Roxy Music. Jobson left again in the beginning of 1984, and Kaye returned. Owner of a Lonely Heart was released as a single in October of 1983, and the album a month later. It was titled 90125, after its catalogue number. The single reached number 1 in the US, and over time the album went 3 times platinum, which made it Yes's biggest selling album. Other singles from the album that impacted the charts and radio were Leave It, and It Can Happen. These songs had music videos made for them. In another sign that Yes was tuned into the MTV era, where they, as 30-somethings, were competing for popularity with artists 10 to 20 years younger, in so doing, they were attracting a new generation of fans. Yes had completely reinvented themselves, which led to mixed reactions from many older prog rock fans, but enthusiasm from pretty much everyone else. The instrumental Cinema won the band its first and only Grammy Award in the Best Rock Instrumental Performance category, and both Owner of a Lonely Heart and the album were nominated for a Grammy for Best Pop Performance by a duo or group with vocal. One reviewer had it that the dinosaurs of not so long ago had made some of the year's freshest, most un-dinosaur-like music. With 90125, Yes had planted itself firmly in the modern music technology-influenced music era, and the album still sounds fresh today. Trevor Horn said in an interview in 2018, "I still think Owner of a Lonely Heart was one of the best tracks I ever did. I think the album as a whole is a really good record. And I could point to loads of things and go, that's brilliant, that's absolutely brilliant. The band, their record company, Adco and Horn, wanted to capitalise on the success of 90125 for the next album, but there were no clear musical visions. And after lots of infighting, the band came up with Big Generator, released in September of 1987, nearly 4 years after its predecessor. The album turned out too poppy and anonymous for the tastes of most fans and critics. The band teamed up with former members Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman and Bill Bruford for Union, which was released in 1991. Perhaps unsurprisingly, with an 8-piece band, the sessions were fraught with tension and the whole was less than the considerable sum of the parts. Yes has released another 10 studio albums since Union, many of them containing great music. But the widespread view is that none of them are as essential as their earlier records, although some of you watching this may disagree, because there's still great music on them. Please let us know in the comments what your favourite Yes albums and songs are. Yes's most recent album is Mirror in the Sky, released earlier this year, featuring the current lineup of old-timers Steve Howe and keyboardist Jeff Downes, with singer John Davison, bassist Billy Sherwood and drummer Jay Shellen. Shellen replaced Alan White, who died in 2022, following Chris Squire, who died in 2015. With the other surviving band members and the band itself still in action, the story of Yes continues to be written. Whatever the future may hold for the band, its legacy as one of the founding fathers of prog rock, and bizarre as it may sound, also of the 80s pop rock, is unassailable. Over the decades, the band's level of musicianship and songwriting has been astounding, and has influenced thousands of musicians around the world and become a central part of the lives of countless fans around the world, with an oeuvre that contains many hours of music that is essential listening. Yes was and remains one of the principal classic rock acts of all time. I've got to be honest, there isn't a genre of Yes I don't like, and when I say that some of those later albums contain great music but maybe aren't as essential, I mean, you could argue with that. I have plenty of times when I put Union on and think it's one of the greatest things. The Yes album was always a favourite of mine. Close to the Edge is arguably the masterpiece. Tales of Topographic Oceans. I mean, there isn't a bad album for me personally. And that extends to Drama. I remember buying Drama and loving it. And you'd be a fool not to say that, Roundabout is not an absolute masterpiece of song, just as much as you'd be a fool for saying that Owner of a Lonely Heart is not a masterpiece of a song. That's the point. Like all of these bands that we love to talk about, they have such a depth in them. They have the experience and wisdom to push the boundaries. And I love every moment of it, whether it's Eddie Offord or Trevor Horn with them, I don't care. This is an incredible band. And I would say get started at the beginning. If you start off with the Yes album, that's a great gateway drug into them. And just listen, go through it. They're an incredible band, amazing musicians. And there's never a dull moment with Yes, never a dull moment. Very, very exciting stuff. So thanks everybody for watching. Please leave any comments and questions below. What's your favourite Yes album? What's your favourite Yes song? Please leave it down below. If there's any artists you want us to talk about, any songs, any bands, any genres, let us know. Thanks everyone. So long. Farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. Au revoir. Adios. Goodbye.